Hey, how's it going, guys? Baron here again. As I've been saying for a while, I was going to do a video about raid composition and try to give you guys an idea of what to look for and what you can expect for Classic. Maybe help out some of you with what kind of class you want to choose and all that sort of thing. And also what specs are viable and standard and which ones are not, things of that nature. Um, so yeah, we'll get right into it. Uh, Here we go. Raid composition for classic WoW. Um, First up, video objectives. List the amount of each role class spec typically are that are brought to raids. Show typical group setup for raids. For synergy and for healers. Uh, I'm trying to give you a good idea of what to expect for your class representation for classic raids, knowing what's your competition for getting into raids and such. How likely is it you're going to find a spot. This will be able to help you out, I believe, and this will definitely be some useful knowledge to many of the startup guilds that are going to be in classic. Try to get you started off on the right foot with knowing what you need to be successful. How many healers, how many tanks, how many melee, how many ranged, all that good stuff. That's what we're trying to do here today. Perspective and class value versus skill value. So my perspective and the perspective of this video is from a min-max point of view. Top 10% of guilds. This is what things are going to look like for the most part. Certain raids and encounters will favor melee more than ranged. Molten Core and Blackwing Lair are a good example of that. Melee pretty much dominate those instances, especially Molten Core and early on. A lot of that's got to do with itemization. Um, the spell hit doesn't really come around until ZG and late BWL. So, once those warlocks and mages start getting access to a lot more of that spell hit, spell power, they really catch up, and especially when they go fire. Certain raids will require more healing and some less. Once again, Molten Core is a good example of that. Um, once Molten Core is on farm, and your healers start to get some of that prebius, you might run some raids with as few as 8 healers in Molten Core. I personally find that 10 is probably a better number, but it really depends on the pace that you're going to set and how many people are how people are doing at staying alive and such and avoiding damage. And also what kind of consumes they're using. So that will all play into how many healers that you're going to need to bring. But generally, for something like Molten Core, 10's a good number. I'll get into some more of that later. But yeah, some raids will require more tanks or less. Once again, Molten Core is a good example of that. You can get by with pretty much everything in Molten Core, trash included, with about 4 tanks. Maybe 5 for something like Sulfuron or Domo. But yeah, that's pretty much about all you need. But later on, Encourage, some of the tech packs in BWL, that trash, and obviously Nax, 4 horsemen, you're going to need more tanks for that stuff. So yeah. And as the title says, class value versus skill value. Almost always choose raiders based on their performance and experience. There will be some cases where you might be bringing someone that you would prefer, um, you know, that you could find a better player or someone that had more experience, but you end up bringing them anyways because they really bring nice buffs to the raid. Paladins and Shamans are usually a good example of that, where you need that 4th blessing or that 3rd blessing. You're just going to bring whatever paladin you can find. Hopefully, you don't find yourself in that situation, and you're prepared, and you got plenty of you got a nice healthy roster, and you won't be in that sort of situation. But there will be some cases where you need to bring the class, and there'll be other situations where uh, you know you might want to bring another hunter over a mage or a warlock just because he's done all the content before. He's going to stay alive, and as we all know, dead DPS do no DPS. So yeah, mechanics and positioning and all that will always take priority. Private server class representation stats. I found this on Reddit a couple of months ago or so. A gentleman, I put the credits there in the bottom. USAP Mess. He's the one that posted it. I don't know if he created it. Whoever did, they created they compiled a bunch of information from private server logs for Classic, and this is what they came up with. So for the total averages there, you're looking at about 10 warriors, 5 rogues, 5 priests, 3 hunters, 2 to 3 druids, 6 mages, 3 to 4 warlocks, and 5 or so paladins and shamans. We're going to get into what is optimal here in just a minute, but I did want to give you guys just a minute to take a look at this. It is fairly accurate, and I agree with most of it. The part that I disagree with is the Horde side numbers. I think the Shaman representation is a bit low. 6 to 8 Shaman is more a better number. Also, you'll see that hunters on some of these are a bit lower represented Horde side than they are Alliance. Not by a huge margin, but half to a full hunter less in some cases than you would find Alliance side. Group synergy is a little bit easier to manage Alliance side due to not needing a shaman in the group. So you're really trying to stack groups with 4 people instead of 5 Horde side. The Druid ratio, kind of the same thing there. If you're going to bring a feral, they obviously fit in to the group a lot easier, Alliance side, and they also get better buffs. And if you're going to bring an enormous amount of shamans, so you can provide totems to everybody, the healers that are going to have less slots are either going to be priest or a druid. So somebody's going to take a hit there to make room for those extra shaman. And as I stated, the shaman ratio is definitely a bit lower than I expected for this. I consider it to be an outlier, but I do trust, from what I've seen here, that it's pretty accurate and seems to be a good representation of what I've seen. So yeah, moving on. Number of roles for raids. So for tanks, 4 to 8. So like I said earlier, Molten Core, 4 to 5 tanks will get you by. That should be the most you need to mess with. BWL, you might need to crank out up to 6 tanks for some of the Wormkin packs for backup, and also for tanking some of the Spellbinders on the tech packs. And then eventually in Naxxramas, it's really good if you can field 8 tanks for that fight. It can be done with less than 8, but I wouldn't recommend bothering with it. I just assume bring someone on a geared alt that has a well-geared warrior to tank if needed. But yeah, most of the time you're just going to have 4 tanks, 2 to 4 tanks up front, taking most of the damage, and then the other Furies can gear up and shield up as needed to help out with that. Physical DPS 14 to 16. I kind of got into this earlier. Having too many melee can cause problems later on. They're outstanding for Molten Core. Physical DPS is outstanding throughout the entire game. It is great, and they need to have a strong presence there. But what I'm getting at is if you're running like 6 melee groups on Cthulhu, that's not optimal at all. If you're running like 6 melee groups on Oro or KT, that is not optimal. It's not even close to being optimal. You're going to have positioning problems, or on Cthulhu, you might have issues trying to kill the tentacles in the stomach. You need to have a balanced raid so that you don't have any problems when you reach these encounters. Caster DPS 12 to 14. As I mentioned, having same thing, having too few casters, that can really hurt you on Cthulhu. That can hurt you on Oro. Below 20%, it gets kind of rowdy for the melee. And for KT as well, the range DPS, they are generally less. They require less maintenance. They take less damage. They're not up there eating the cleaves and stuff. So You want to have a good balance there, and that's what I've found it to be. 14 to 16 melee, 12 to 14 casters. Healers, this will vary quite a bit, more than the others. As I said, if you're trying to do speed running, especially for Molten Core or BWL, you might trim it down to as few as 8 healers, 8, 9, 10, something like that. I think 10 is a really good balanced number for pretty much all raids except for Nax. But when we get into 10 healers is fine for BWL. It's fine for AQ40. When you're doing progression, you might want to bring as many as 12. I like to go a little healer heavy for progression, but that's what you can usually expect or should be doing for your healer slots. Naxxramas, it obviously it is nice to bring more healers for certain fights like Saffron. 14 healers is really nice to have for Saffron. Really, you're able to keep everybody topped off a lot better, and you'll have less deaths. Same thing for Four Horsemen. Healers have a really tough time staying alive on that encounter, so bringing some additional healers to that fight can make it easier as well. And even KT, you do need to have enough damage to really burn him down below 40%, but a few extra healers can actually keep, there's a higher probability that you're going to keep people alive from the Frost Blast. So yeah, you'll just have to play it by ear on that. But yeah, 8 to 14, it does vary quite a bit. Ideal class representation and specializations. Starting off with Warrior. 8 to 12 is usually the amount of warriors you want to bring. Warriors should typically be the highest represented class in all of Classic. They can tank, and they can DPS, and they don't really need to respec in a lot of cases to do those. So as long as they got the gear with them, they can fulfill 2 roles to an extremely high standard. So you're going to want your main tank, your off tank protection, or Fury Defiance, something of that sort. They need to be able to generate an enormous amount of threat and stay alive. And then any additional tanks you need past those first 2, they're just going to be a full Fury DPS spec, so that when they're not needed to tank, they can just be putting out the pain. And of course, as it says here, no Mortal Strike. Mortal Strike takes up a debuff slot. It is, unfortunately, it's not worth in Classic. I would stay away from it. Rogues, 4 to 6, all combat. With world buffs, I've seen Seal Fate work, but it's really late game, like Naxxramas. You're much better off and much safer just going combat. Blade Flurry is amazing for a lot of the Molten Core fights and Cleave fights. So, there's that. Rogues and Warriors, the issue there is really one of the Warriors can tank, have the ability to tank. The Rogues and the Warriors do similar damage. There'll be some fights where the Rogues beat out the Warriors, but for the most part, they'll be neck and neck, or the Warriors will be ahead. So I'm not saying there's no reason to bring Rogues. Rogues can do well. They put out a lot of damage. They generally take less damage than Warriors do as well, and they have other abilities, evasion, vanish, that can really help with threat or getting out of a pinch, staying alive. And they're obviously also needed for certain encounters like the Suppression Room and BWL. But in general, you want the majority of your melee core to be Fury Warriors, just because they can, they got that utility. They can tank, they can DPS, and they do both very well. The Rogues are just limited to DPS, and you'll definitely want 4 to 6 in a raid, but that's about the right class representation you want for Rogue there. Moving on, Hunter. One of the least represented classes typically, as I showed you earlier in that private server data. All of them need to be marksmanship. When you factor in the 100 AP that they bring to the rest of the party, especially Alliance side, they might be a little bit lower down the list. They do great in MC and they do great in BWL, but after that they do typically taper off a little bit. Even though in Nax I've seen them, be top 10. They can still get up there, but in general the Furies and the Fire Mages and the Warlocks are going to be ahead of them. But just make sure that when you're you're bringing your Hunters, you can't just look at their own DPS by itself on the meters. You also have to factor in that they're bringing that 100 AP to 4 other melee members alliance side or 3 other melee members uh, horde side. And I've also got frequent requests for hunters to try out survival. I think it is a personal DPS boost for the hunters to go survival, but it is not a raid DPS increase. The 100 AP for the additional melee is just too strong. And if you need additional threat for your tank, you can obviously put them in the tank group too. Mage, 5 to 8. That's typically what you would bring. BWL MC, obviously they're going to be Frost. You'll want 1 Mage doing Winter's Chill. That'll get you that 10% Frost crit chance debuff on the boss. And then all the other mages, you want them to go Arcane Power Frost. That'll get them the maximum single target DPS they can get with Frostbolt. So that's how you'll operate with your mages. Once you get to AQ and Nax, Fire is definitely a much higher DPS spec for the mages, and they'll definitely go Fire for AQ forward. Just a full Fire spec for all of them. Elemental is also an option if you're going back and forth between the fire resistant raids, the first 2, and AQ or something, but generally they just want to be full fire spec as it is kind of mana intensive. Warlocks, 4 to 6. As I'll show you here in a minute, a raid setup. You can bring one, Shadow Mastery Ruin Warlock for the Imp buff for Group 1 for your tank group. It's not required, but I think it is nice for progression. That extra, it's about 500 HP almost, especially when you factor in buffs. So it is pretty nice for the tanks. 500 health is pretty nice. Other than that, though, they all need to be the Demonic Sack Ruin spec for maximum Shadowbolt DPS. Moving into the healer section, Shamans, 6 to 8 is the ideal number. In a perfect world, you'd have a shaman for every group. You might not have that amount of shaman in your raid to be able to do that, but for every shaman you don't have, there's going to be warlocks or mages missing out on threat reduction, or healers missing out on their mana totems. So just keep that in mind. You want the majority of your healing core horde side to definitely be shaman. Shaman are outstanding healers, and they bring the very best buffs. The only weakness of shaman, well, one of the big weaknesses of shaman is that they can't remove magic, but that's what you got priest for, horde side. No elemental or enhance. In a very rare occasion, very rare, maybe you'll bring an enhance with a nightfall, but if they really just, you just want all your shamans to be resto. But if you are going to bring an enhance, make sure he's got a nightfall. But I personally, I wouldn't bother with it. Nightfall is much better in the hands of a warrior. Totem twist when possible. So for a lot of these fights, I guess the best example would be like Ebon Rock or Flame Gore if your hunters know how to trank shot. There's not really a lot of damage going out, so you can totem twist with Tranquil Air and Wind Fury Totem, and that's very important for the beginning of fights. That'll let your melee get in there and start DPS a little faster without the worry of peeling threat quite as much. But later on, you can also twist with Grace of Air, which will give them a nice little DPS boost. However, let me go back one there. For Shaman, if you are going to totem twist, it does eat up a lot of mana, and you will eat into your healing a great deal, as there's a 1.5 second global cooldown. So, and you got to do it every 10 seconds. So you're going to lose 3 seconds of cast time out of every 10 seconds, and it's going to cost you. I don't remember the totem mana cost off the top of my head, but it's close to 300 mana for each totem. So you're losing 600 mana and 3 seconds of cast time every 10 seconds. It can get quite taxing to do totem twisting. Moving on, Paladin, kind of the same story. You can get by with less Paladins because they can buff the entire raid 4 paladins will generally get you buffs on everything, anything, everything anyone would want. You can go as high as 6. The auras are nice, especially for Nax or stuff like that. You want them all to be holy. If you have spare paladins that just they don't have anything to bless, we're talking about like the 5 to 6 range bringing paladins, and obviously it's beneficial to have one of them respect sanctuary. Grab that. It's not a huge buff. It's not a required buff, but it's a free buff. Why not? Reduces damage taken by like 24. It's decent. Adds a little bit of threat when the warriors block if they're wearing a shield. um, no ret or protection paladins. I've looked into that. That's not something that I would want in one of my raids. Kind of the same story with ret as it is for enhancement shaman. If you are going to have a ret paladin and you absolutely need that extra blessing, and I don't know, maybe they're a good friend or whatever, and they're really bringing the heat. Give them a nightfall, and they can pull a little bit of weight when you factor in the nightfall damage. But for the most part, you just want all your paladins healing and not tanking. Moving on, priest. Priests are extremely solid healers. They bring the fort buff, which is a must-have, and they Horde side, they're extremely important because they're the only class that can remove magic. So, Chromagus or Core Hounds, stuff like that. The priests are really going to have to be on the ball with cleaning the raid. 3 to 5 is a good number. You could go as high as 6. Horde side know that every extra priest you bring is probably a shaman that you're not bringing, so you're losing out on totems. And just always keep that in mind. If you can, you want to get totems to the entire raid. But at the same time, you got to have good balance there. If you run into a boss where you need to dispel magic, you got to have the appropriate amount of priests to do that. So 3 to 5 is pretty solid for both factions. You want all of them to go PI, power infusion, for your casters. You might have one go shadow, as I spoke about earlier. You need to get that 15% shadow damage debuff up there somehow. It's generally considered that the best min-max way to do that is with a PI or a Holy Weaving Priest, where he's like healing half the time and he's re-upping the debuff the other half of the time. But finding someone that wants to do that role and that will do it well is going to be quite difficult. So the more likely of the two is you'll find someone that wants to go Shadow Priest full time. I would take, you're okay going either way there. You're going to lose a couple of debuff slots if you go with a Shadow Priest, but you got to get that 15% shadow damage up there somehow for the Warlocks, just so they're happy to. And lastly, Druid, 1 to 3 Druids per raid, 1 to 2 Resto. There might be cases in Nax where you have more than 2, but just always realize that the hots don't stack, and Druids can't res, so they don't really contribute when it comes to recovery. And one Druid can really buff the entire raid. So 1 to 2 Resto is usually a good number. I mean, Druids can put out an enormous amount of healing, and I've seen it done. They have the potential to top meters. It's not like they're bad healers, but as far as stacking goes, you're better off stacking paladins and priests that can really help with speeding up recovery, and they bring more blessings to the raid and such. But you get the battle res, and then if you got a feral, you get another innervate there. Yeah, I did leave balanced resto Nax optional. This is something that I really wasn't going to put that on there, but I do somewhat like the idea of having a balance / restoration druid for Nax, because there's so many different fights where you'll need less healing and then you'll need more healing, and you can spec in a way that can kind of where he can be Moonkin one fight and then he can heal the next, and go back and forth. But generally that's not done. Generally, Moonkin damage is pretty darn low. but you know the crit damage can be decent for some of your casters later on. So most of the time, I would definitely stay away from that. But if you know if you got a druid that really knows how to mix it up, and you don't want to be running too many healers on, say, like Spider Wing and or the A-bomb wing, you know, he can DPS a bit, and then when you get to Four Horsemen or Saf or KT, he can switch over and heal and do a great job at both. Finally, we get to look at some group makeups here. This would be alliance side we're going to look at first. All right, so typically group one is your tank group. Make sure you're setting things up roughly the same way every time. You don't want your healers having to guess where the melee are or where the tanks are. You always they need to get into um, uh, you know they need to be very aware of where the tanks are and where all the melee are going to be. So generally groups 1 through 4 melee groups, groups 5 through 8 healing and caster groups. So that'll really help your healers out with you know just consistency. So yeah, tank group one, you're going to have your main tank, your off tank in there. You might have some other DPS in there. As I said, afflictions, you know, lock in there for the imp buff. That's completely optional, and you got your paladin in there for Devo Aura. If the affliction lock wasn't there, you just have another Fury Warrior there. Group two, power melee group. The feral buff, if you're going to run one. The crit buff benefits Fury a little bit more than it does rogues. So, you know, that's how that would look. You would want to stack the Furies with the feral and the hunter. If you're not going to run a feral, just put another rogue in there or another Fury warrior. Group 3 and 4, kind of the same story, just standard melee groups. Always make sure your rogues are getting battle shout. Always make sure they're getting battle shout. It's an enormous buff to rogue DPS. Moving on down the line, these are roughly equally constructed groups. Groups 5 through 8. As you can see, we're running 7 mages in this group and a total of 5 warlocks. You want to spread out your priests in case they feel like using prayer healing. Paladins are spread out for auras. And the warlocks and the mages are split up so that, you know, if I want to assign, if I wanted to split up groups based on, say, let's say Nefarian. You know, let's say we walked up to Nefarian and we're about to do that fight. With the way I have this raid split up, I can say, you know, odds left, evens right, and then split up the tanks, and bam, we're good to go. We're ready to pull Nefarian. Whereas if I got all my mages in one group and then I get all my warlocks in another group, they aren't getting, you know, prayer healing if that's something they want to use. It's just better to have them split up like this, and it's easier to assign to give assignments to the raid when they're equally split up like that. But yeah, that's how things are going to look typically alliance side. Just make sure that your tanks are always up there in group 1. You might have a tank in group 3 or 4. Always do things the same way so those healers know where those tanks are going to be and they don't have to look for them and they can get to them very quickly. As you can see, there's no Shadow Priest listed here. One of these Discipline Priests would be a PI Weaving Priest. If you didn't feel like doing, you know, if you can't find one of those, you could swap one out for just a straight Shadow Priest, or you could swap a Mage out for a Shadow Priest. You know, either of those would be an option. And last up, we got Horde. As you'll see, you know, the Horde group layout is a bit different because we're having to inject a healer into each group for that Wind Fury. So same story. Group 1, we got our tanks in there. We got a Shaman there. We're getting a Wind Fury, Strength of Earth. Moving on, we got groups 2 through 5. Because we're putting a healer in each of these groups, you will have some bleed over into group 5 Horde side with melee. There's only one extra melee on this raid than there was on the Alliance raid that I just showed to you, but they're bleeding off into group 5 because there's a healer in each group. There's a shaman in each group. So it's not no worries there. Uh, Typically, group 5 will end up being a mix, uh, but both Horde and Alliance. If I have extra melee, they'll go in group 5. Um, so yeah, your shaman, he's going to drop Wind Fury for the two Furies there. And then groups 6 and 7, caster groups, dropping the threat reduction totem. But as you can see here, we only have 7 shaman. If we had an 8th shaman, we would have to drop a priest, or we would have to drop something to get that 8th shaman in there. Otherwise, these mages they're going to have to do without their 20% threat reduction. Hopefully, they don't get the ignite stack, and it's one of the other mages. Uh, Warlocks don't get any threat reduction at all, so I would prioritize them over the mages for threat reduction. I guess it depends on the fight, but for most of them, I think they would be better suited for the threat reduction, as mages get a 30% just from talents. And then yeah, so whatever's left over for your healers are just going to be stacked in group 8. Or if I had a 8th shaman, then I can kind of divide up the healers, and they would get totems and stuff as well. But that's usually what you're going to look at there for Horde side. And as I said earlier, the Feral and the Hunter, they miss out on Paladin buffs. Uh, that's why personally I wouldn't want to go Feral Horde side. It's doable, but it's not really debatable that an Alliance Druid will have more buffs and more potential DPS and such than a Horde Druid would. That's fact. Um, and I went over Shadow Priest. One of these priests would be PI weaving. One of these discipline priests to get that 15% shadow damage debuff for these warlocks. But if you can't find anybody to do that, like I said, just get a full-time shadow priest and you'll be just fine. There's no problem with that either. So yeah, hopefully that gives you guys an idea of what you can expect in terms of class representation for a higher end guild. Um, I use this website quite a bit. I wish that would go away. Raidcomp.mmochampion.com. That's how I made these raids. Um, Throughout the time that I've been playing WoW, I've used that tool an enormous amount to put raids together outside of raid time, and kind of see how I can make groups work or get more synergy out of them and such. So, if you're an officer or looking to start your own guild, I've found that to be a useful tool. So, I would give it a look. Thanks everybody, appreciate it. I've been saying I would do a video on class or raid composition for a while. I apologize that it took so long. Definitely not the fanciest video you've ever seen, I'm sure, but hopefully there was some good information in there for you. I'll be streaming a lot for Classic, so please look us up. Baron Cstrike Gaming on YouTube. If you got questions or you want to ask me about something, by all means hit me up in Discord. I'll be if I can't answer it for you, I'll try to point you in the right direction. And like I said, I hope this helped, guys. I appreciate you guys as always. Good luck in Classic. I hope it's a blast, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks, everybody.